Hey, Vanessa here, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to make one row buttonholes. These are horizontal buttonholes that are worked in just one row over any number of stitches in any stitch pattern, and they are firm and durable. I worked these buttonholes over 2 stitches in this swatch for my Nydia cardigan pattern, but by the end of this video, you're going to know how to make buttonholes in any size for any project. Let's go. First, let's start by working in pattern to the spot where we want to make the first buttonhole. The first and last button should be fairly close to the beginning and end of the band. So my pattern calls for 5 stitches at each end, and if you're working another pattern, it should tell you how many stitches to work, or you may have done the math yourself. Okay, so now we're ready to make a buttonhole, and I ended with a purl stitch, which is perfect because my yarn needs to stay in front. So leave your yarn in the front if it's there, move it there if it's not, and then slip the next stitch purlwise. Next, move the yarn to the back and slip another stitch purlwise. Now, pass the second stitch on the right needle over the first to bind it off. All right, that's one stitch bound off. We're going to slip a second stitch from the left needle with the yarn still in back, pass it over the first to bind off, and that's 2 stitches bound off. I'm going to stop binding off here, but I want to take a moment to explain that the number of stitches you bind off determines the size of your buttonhole. So if you have a larger button or you're using a heavier weight yarn, you can keep repeating the last 2 steps to bind off as many stitches as you need. Once you've done that, slip the stitch back to your left needle, and then turn your work. Now move the yarn to the back between the needles. And now we're going to cable cast on 1 stitch more than we bound off. Since I've bound off 2 stitches, I'm going to cable cast on 3 stitches. But if you bound off more than 2 stitches to make a larger buttonhole, cast on that number plus 1. So to cable cast on, we're going to insert our right needle between the first 2 stitches on the left needle into the space right here from front to back. And so insert the needle, wrap the yarn around the needle as if you're knitting and draw up a new stitch. Elongate that stitch a little, and then take your left needle and insert it into the new stitch from right to left to slip it to the left needle. And that's 1 cable cast on stitch. I'm going to do that again. Insert the right needle between the 2 stitches on the left needle. Wrap the yarn around to knit it. Draw that loop up. Swing the left needle around and into the stitch from right to left. And place it on the left needle. That's 2 cable cast on stitches. I'm going to do one more. Insert the needle. Wrap the yarn around. And draw up that loop to grab it from right to left. And that mounts the stitch correctly on the left needle. So once you've casted on the number of stitches that you need, go ahead and turn the work again. And move the yarn to the back between the needles. Slip 1 stitch from the left needle, and we're going to pass that second stitch on the right needle, that extra cable cast on stitch, over the stitch we just slipped to bind off 1. And that closes the buttonhole. Now here you don't want to tighten your yarn too much, or else you're going to get some unwanted holes to the left of the buttonholes. It's really easy to over tighten here. Also, about the last stitch that we slipped to the right needle and passed the extra cast on stitch over, bear in mind that that stitch was not worked. So if you don't slip it back to your left needle, which we're going to do in the next step, it's going to be weirdly elongated and also create a gap to the left of the buttonhole. So we're going to slip it back to the left needle so we can work it. And again, here, do not tighten the yarn too much because you can create unsightly little holes next to the buttonhole. So now all you do is work in pattern to the next spot where you need to make a buttonhole. I like to work the next stitch or 2 a little tighter, just as another precaution to avoid the holes I've been talking about. But just keep in mind, don't pull or yank on the yarn, especially right next to the buttonholes. Okay, we're gonna do this next buttonhole closer up. Here's a quick look at our first buttonhole. But because I just ended on a knit stitch, my yarn is in the back, so I need to move it to the front before I make the next buttonhole. So move the yarn to the front if it's not already there, and then slip one stitch purlwise. Move the yarn to the back between the needles, and slip another stitch purlwise. Pass the second stitch on the right needle over the first to bind off one. Slip another stitch from the left needle and bind off a second stitch. Again, if you need a larger buttonhole, bind off the number of stitches that you need. Okay, now pass that stitch back to the left needle and turn the work. Now move the yarn to the back and cable cast on one more stitch than you bound off. So we're going to insert our needle between the first two stitches on the left needle, knit one, and draw up that loop, elongating it a bit. Grab the stitch from right to left, and then repeat those steps to cast on the number of stitches that you need. Be sure to keep that cast on relaxed. I'm going for 3, and once I've got that, I'm going to turn the work once again. Move the yarn to the back, slip one stitch purlwise, pass the second stitch on the right needle over the first to bind off and close the buttonhole. Then slip that last stitch back to the left needle because we need to work it. Adjust the tension if needed, but don't tighten too much here to avoid those holes I was telling you about earlier. And then simply keep working in pattern. All right, here's a look at what these buttonholes should look like right after the row. They're not overly obvious, and you might be thinking they look a little small, but stick around until the end of this video to see why this is ideal. Now, you're probably wondering what the next step is, and you could actually just continue knitting the rest of the rows in pattern. But I personally like to knit the cast on stitches through the back loops on the following row to make the buttonholes even neater. Let me show you how I do that. Work in pattern to the buttonhole stitches, which will be a cluster of the casted on stitches plus 2. My 2 casted on stitches are right here in the middle. So I work the first stitch of the cluster normally in pattern, and then work the casted on stitches through the back loops in pattern. I'm knitting this stitch through the back loop, purling this stitch through the back loop, and then I'm just going to work the last stitch of the cluster normally before continuing the row. Like I said, this is completely optional, but try it out and see what you think. So now the moment you've been waiting for, the button fit check. All jokes aside, you will actually want the holes to be slightly smaller than your buttons so they don't undo themselves. Here I've got a 5/8 inch or 1.5 centimeter button with a 2-stitch buttonhole. And we're aiming for a bit of stretch but not resistance. And that went through just fine. I can trust that my garment will stay closed and not pop open. So yeah, if you already have your buttons but you're unsure how many stitches wide your buttonhole should be, make a swatch. And just remember, the buttonhole should not be the same size as your button, and it's better to have a smaller hole since knit fabric is stretchy. Well, if this video has helped you master one-row buttonholes, please be sure to boop the like button and check out this next video. I'm here and happy to help you be successful in your knitting.